we have a serious problem in this country, and it's not systemic racism or discrimination or environmental pollution or any of the other issues that may exist in this country. It's the fact that we are not talking about real Canadian issues in Canadian contexts. You see, most recently, our national conversation has revolved around two things. First, it was the gun ban, where Prime Minister Trudeau and Bill Blair banned 1,500 assault-style rifles. And most recently, of course, it was the George Floyd protests and anti-black racism. Now, these are both issues that we should discuss as Canadians. There should be nothing that is sacred that we cannot discuss or debate the merits of or how we're going to change or govern this country. But I want to look at both of these issues for a second and try and figure out why we are being fed so much American propaganda and whether or not these things are actually problems in this country. So first we have, this is the gun list. So there's the 1,500 assault-style rifles that they banned. But if we do a quick search, we're going to find things like the missile launcher 9K111 Fagot. This is a anti-tank rocket. Or just below it, the missile launcher 9K310 Igla 1, Strela 2, Strela 3, Igla. These are all surface-to-air missiles. So if you're talking about assault-style rifles, unless you plan on assaulting some police helicopters or army helicopters, that's not the gun that you're discussing. That's simply a red herring. And I don't know, these things they tossed in simply to pad up the numbers to make it sound like they banned 1,500 different versions of AR-15s. You know, we will only know, we will never know unless perhaps someone at the cabinet table decides to tell us. But the issue is, why did the Prime Minister and Bill Blair focus on this issue so fervently? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, it is easy to do because we're all so steeped in American culture. We tend to consume a lot of American media. We tend to listen to a lot of American music and watch American TV shows, American movies. And so we often feel that what's going on in the States and the culture that's there is really the same culture that we have. And it's only once you travel to the States that you notice that things are a bit different. Second, it allows them to focus attention on other problems rather than ones that actually exist here and ones that may even be of their own creation. So by focusing on the 1,500 assault-style rifles, it really allowed them to sidestep this one, which is the missing and murdered indigenous women. Now, there were numerous inquiries on this, and the Prime Minister made this a key pillar of his election platform. Twice he said that he was going to deal with First Nations and Indigenous issues, and instead he's doing an order in council, which is, it's pretty low to do that, or pretty shady to do that in the middle of a crisis, not have a chance to discuss that, and then on top of it, when you actually, when you look at the list and you find these AT guns and things like that, it should raise a lot of questions. So that's the first one. Then the second one is this one. You may recall the Prime Minister heading out to the protest and taking a knee in solidarity. So my colleague Candice Malcolm had a very solid point, which is, what is the Canadian context of this? Why is he taking a knee? It's totally not clear how this is a Canadian thing. What does it have to do with Canada? We don't have the NFL. We don't have Colin Kaepernick here where this whole thing started, this whole taking a knee business. But more than that, he's not just a guy, or he's not just a guy with name recognition, or even a platform. So he's not me, and he's not you. He's the Prime Minister of this country. And so if there's anyone out there that could make a change on what's going on with anti-black racism in this country, it's got to be that guy. It's got to be him. Now, I know that it's an important issue to discuss, and I'm not trying to minimize or downplay any of the difficulties or the racism faced by Black Canadians or by any minority group or by any Canadian. And yes, you can discriminate against anyone regardless of their skin color if you are making a discrimination based on that alone. And this is actually what I want to talk about, the types of discrimination and how we can help look at some of these issues and understand them. Now, Thomas Sowell, who I admire very much, Dr. Thomas Sowell, is an economist and political commentator, and he provides a useful tool to understand how we can look at some of these things. Now, one of the ways we can look at discrimination is by breaking it down into three parts. So we can have a discrimination 1A. I've got them down here. So we can have a discrimination 1A, discrimination 1B, and discrimination 2. So this entire section right here in the column. Discrimination 1B is when you are discriminated against based on characteristics specific to the individual and the relevant to you. So someone is discriminating against me because of something that I did, or some personal history that I have. That is very specific discrimination against me as an individual. It has nothing to do with any of my other attributes. It doesn't matter that I'm Jewish or that I'm a male. None of these things matter. 1B is, I think, where a lot of people get into trouble, and this is trying to predict unknown individual characteristics based on known group characteristics. So I had another example that I'm going to use in a previous column, and that was during COVID. If you, for example, went to a language school and there were a group of Iranian foreign exchange students, and you know that all of them go back and forth to Iran on a regular basis, but you don't know which ones have gone to Iran recently and which ones have not. And again, you're in a language school, so you may not actually speak English or may not be able to communicate with them effectively. Now, you're going to have to make a choice. And again, keep in mind, this is when Iran had a COVID outbreak, a very strong COVID outbreak. So you're going to decide based on the known characteristic, the known group characteristic, that they all are Iranian foreign exchange students and they all go to Iran frequently. You're going to decide to predict the unknown individual characteristic is that this person may have gone to Iran recently, and therefore I'm going to avoid them. This is very, very different than discrimination 2, which Dr. Somerso lists as the more typical animus or the hate-based racism that you're probably thinking about. And this is, I'm going to discriminate against this person because they're Iranian, or because they're black, or because they're Asian, or Jewish, or white, or whatever. This is where you get into trouble between 1B and 2. And there's a debate to be made between when you're going from 1B to 2. That is the thin line that separates discrimination between something that is reasonable and something that is clearly not reasonable. Now, why is this important? I bring it up in the article here. It's important to look at the types of discrimination because thus far, we've just been talking about police brutality and general racism, general discrimination, and in this case, the Prime Minister and a lot of his cabinet, anti-black racism. Now, there are a couple of different things that we have to keep in mind with the black community in Canada and the black community in the States. There's the fact that Canada never had that legacy of slavery, the fact that 56% of them are first-generation immigrants, so it's more of an immigrant community as opposed to a community that's been here for a long time. Again, we didn't have that legacy of slavery. We did not have Jim Crow laws. We did not have a lot of the problems or intercommunal problems that they did in the United States. And that's not at all to say that we don't have our own problems, and that is literally my entire point. You may have heard of something called carding or street checks. This was something that was done in Toronto until about 2014. It's still done in some other cities. And this is when the police pull you over and they basically ask for your ID and what you're doing. Now, this can be anywhere a police officer is. They don't have to suspect you of any crime. It could be in public property, or on private property. It could be just anywhere you bump into a police officer, they can suddenly street check or card you. And this was stopped in Toronto because the Toronto Star showed that a higher proportion of black and brown-skinned Canadians were getting stopped. And similar results were found apparently in Vancouver, where both black and indigenous people were more likely to be considered suspicious, and so therefore they were street checked more than others. Now, this is a serious Canadian issue, and the Charter protections against unlawful search and seizure or detainment aside, which those are also very important issues to discuss if carding is even constitutional, but it is important to discuss this issue, and I would like to know whether or not they are deploying and employing type 1A, 1B, or type 2 discrimination. Did they pull this person over arbitrarily because they are black? Did they pull them over because they're trying to predict some unknown characteristic based on a group characteristic? And I have an example here about street checking James's friend in a high crime area because he was previously seen there with James and his gang. So again, is it something like that where you suspect that it could be the case, but you're not quite sure? Or do they actually know this person? They might recognize him. The officer knows or is familiar with him and he has a previous criminal history or just interactions with the police, and so they decide to street check him. So this is a serious Canadian issue. We need to be talking about Canadian issues. We need to be talking about anti-black racism through a Canadian lens. We need to be talking about discrimination and police brutality through a Canadian lens. We need to be talking about violence against Indigenous women through a Canadian lens. But we're not going to be able to do that when the Prime Minister is so focused on what's going on south of the border. Now, there's a lot of reasons that he does that, and I might get into it in another video, and I'm going to put out a column about it. But in a nutshell, because we're so steeped in American culture, it works. It makes it easy to fool Canadians and to talk to them about American phenomenon and just make it seem like this is something that goes on in this country. So the important thing that we all need to do as Canadians is put on our critical thinking hats. I've got my critical thinking yarmulke on here. We need to put on our critical thinking hats, and we need to examine the issues. Is there discrimination? What type of discrimination? If the outcomes are not the same, what is the reason for the outcomes? A good book that I recommend on this one, again, is Dr. Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities. What are the reasons for the different outcomes? What is the reason for the discrimination? It's something we need to know. It's something we need to discuss. And by simply discussing American issues, we are basically allowing and encouraging those Canadian issues to stand. So for True North, I'm Sam Eskenasi. Thank you so much for watching.